Hello, everyone. This is Brock Allen from Developmentor, and thanks for coming to this webcast on ASP.NET 5. This broadcast is a two-part series, if you will. We're going to do one this week and one next week. And really, this is here to help promote our new course at Developmentor, where we do training. We do training on all kinds of .NET and other technologies. I happen to focus on .NET and web development. And this course, this video here is to promote the course that we have, the new course on ASP.NET 5 and MVC 6, which is, quite a change from what Microsoft has been doing in the past in terms of their web platform. And so what we're going to do is we're going to take sort of a little look at what's new and how things are going to be different for web development on this new ASP.NET 5. Like I said, this session is really one of two. This first one here today, we're going to focus on kind of the whole big picture of what this new ASP.NET 5 thing is all about. And that involves looking at something called DNX, which is the .NET execution environment. We have a sort of a new mechanism for loading web application code, and we're going to look at that. So we're going to spend about half of our time looking at this thing called DNX. And then we'll move and look into this thing called ASP.NET 5, and we're basically going to see what this new web platform looks like. ASP.NET 5 is pretty much replacing what we had before in terms of ASP.NET 4.x, I suppose, in terms of HTTP handlers and modules, and so we'll look and see what that's all about. Our session that we're going to do next week is then going to focus on MVC 6. So MVC 6 then is going to sit on top of ASP.NET 5 and give us a framework for building, controllers and views and actions and things like that for building our, web applications and also, by the way, web APIs. So here's kind of the big picture here with this new web stack, is that Microsoft for actually many years has been slowly moving away from their prior web stack, which was system.web. So system.web is the, sort of the original ASP.NET. If you think about system.web.dll, that was the framework that Microsoft came out when .NET 1.0 came out. And that was their framework for doing web development. And at the time, it was there to replace the old classic ASP system that we had prior. And so really what ASP.NET gave us was this framework for building, web servers where we could receive a request and generate a response. And so that web server basically, had this whole HTTP pipeline architecture going on with these handlers and modules. And then on top of that, Microsoft invented this abstraction called web forms for us to build pages and have a whole object model in the server for rendering pages or applications back to the browser. So that framework has been around for many, many years. It turns out that it's fairly monolithic. It's a pretty large system. And again, fundamentally, I'm talking about system.web.dll and the way it receives requests and generates responses. And so for a couple of years, Microsoft's been slowly moving away from this. You guys might have heard of OWIN and Katana from a few years ago as sort of the new way of doing web hosting. And so that was the start of this migration or this departure from this web system that we've had for, well over 10 years now. So Microsoft, to write code in this environment, you have to write in, you're writing .NET code, which of course is a compiled language. And so the idea is that requires a build step. Now, there are many other programming environments these days on web servers that actually don't require that. And so, the one that comes to mind is Node.js. Node.js is a very popular environment for building, web applications, and it has no concept of at least an intrinsic build step because JavaScript is intrinsically, it's going to be interpreted. You just load up source files and your web server can run. And so, that's a small little thing in terms of our sort of day-to-day coding of applications, but Microsoft's looked at that for a while, and it's been very compelling to people, and they find that to be a refreshing sort of approach. So Microsoft's been looking at lots of different other frameworks and the little features that they add that make sort of web development sort of the modern, if you will. And that's one example of why the old system.web architecture is a little bit, shall we say, antiquated. Another approach, or another reason we have this entirely new system that's going to be coming out with ASP.NET is of how we do dependencies. So again, traditionally we would go and grab some assembly that we needed. We had sort of the perhaps the global assembly cache that we would reference assemblies from, or if there was some third-party library, you would have to know and go and access that and download it and install it in some way. And again, Microsoft many years ago, looked at how other environments were doing this, and they came up with this idea of NuGet to kind of copy the way other people were doing it, and that was a really good first step at having a modern sort of packaging system. But again, there are problems with NuGet and other environments. Again, Node.js, they have some really slightly different ways about going about that, which are a little bit more, shall we say, a little bit nicer to work with than what we have today with NuGet. So anyway, Microsoft's been wanting to have a new packaging system or an update, if you will, at least to the packaging system that we use today. Some more motivations for why Microsoft's looking at a new web framework. Again, kind of gets back to the concept of system.web being a very, sort of a large, antiquated system. Again, that was built more than 10 years ago with certain assumptions in mind about how we're building web applications. And over the years, they have built in more and more functionality to, provide more and more functionality, more features. But there's a cost in doing that. And so system.web as a runtime is actually a very heavyweight framework. When requests come into our web server, there's a bunch of code running in system.web that, we may or may not care about in our applications. And so there's processing, so overhead of certain things running. For example, things like session state. I really dislike session state in applications, and I don't use that in any of the apps that I build. But there is code running in system.web that accommodates session state, even though I have an application that's not even using it or don't want it. So that takes overhead. Also, just in terms of all of the data structures that need to be maintained to build this very big, feature-rich web server or web application framework of ASP.NET, there's a lot of memory overhead. So I think I saw some blog post from Microsoft saying that every request coming into the web server takes up 30K of memory. That's actually quite a bit of overhead for every single request. And so if you want to build a web server that can be very high density with lots and lots of requests concurrently, you need a lot of memory to deal with that. And so Microsoft's been looking at a way to slim down their web server so it's much more lightweight, and it only is going to be able to run or only will run the code that you actually need it or want it to run. So that's another reason that Microsoft has been considering this new architecture to move away from system.web. Dependency injection, that's a very, very kind of common requirement these days to build testable systems. And, with the older ASP.NET architecture, dependency injection wasn't really built in. They added it sort of after the fact into MVC as a framework, but that's on top in an additional framework. And so Microsoft, at the lower levels, really want dependency injection to be everywhere. Okay, so that's another reason that we kind of need a reboot to our web server architecture. Another big reason that Microsoft's looking at this new framework is just for flexibility in terms of configuration and deployment. A lot of times people are deploying to, their own on-prem web servers, but then a lot of times we're talking about using, cloud servers. And so we have a lot of different deployment scenarios, and we have different environment scenarios for how we want to configure these things. And, the old web.config approach with the web config transforms that we had in the past, a lot of people had problems with those. Sometimes they just weren't such a great experience. And so that's another a ripe item to have updated and sort of redone. And another kind of motivation for Microsoft, spending all this effort and coming up with this brand new framework is they had two frameworks in the past, or at least the two modern frameworks were MVC and Web API, and there was a ton of overlap between those two frameworks. They were both there for handling requests. They were both kind of using an MVC, architecture. But a lot of times people would, have a question about, well, where do I put, my application code? Some of it MVC, some of it Web API. It's kind of confusing that there's a ton of overlap conceptually, but zero overlap at the binary level. So there are no shared libraries between those at all. And so that was another sort of feature that Microsoft wanted is, instead of reinventing the wheel over and over for two different frameworks, it makes more sense to consolidate them and have a single standard web framework that can both render HTML pages, but as well also render data like JSON for web services. So again, particularly that particular topic, we're not going to talk too much about here. In this session, we have a whole nother session next week about MVC 6, which, if you're not aware, is the unification of MVC 5 and Web API 2. One last thing then that Microsoft has been pushing for some time is, a few things related to this last bullet point here, is that Microsoft has this problem with ASP.NET, and just .NET in general, is that .NET is pretty much a machine-wide installation library, if you will. And so you might have a web server running on, .NET 4.5. But then Microsoft comes along, and when they do an update to .NET, they, do an in-place update of the CLR. And so, you might upgrade to 4.5.1, say. That may or may not break your existing applications. So if you have new applications that are developing on the latest, but you have an old application, on some prior version of .NET 4.5, your web server admins are a little reluctant, for good reason, to just update the web server so that you can deploy your new application. Because, you don't always get absolute guarantees that in-place updates of .NET won't break something in an existing application. So this has been something that's been plaguing, sort of web server admins, I suppose, for a while, but then also Microsoft's wanting to solve this problem, is that it would be really nice if we had some mechanism where your application could be side by side with other applications and be independent of the version of .NET. So anyway, there's this whole long list of sort of things that Microsoft has on their to-do list, if you will, in terms of their desires to build a brand new, more modern web framework that really can compete on par with some of these other environments like Node.js. And so that's kind of what this ASP.NET 5 thing is all about. So what ASP.NET 5 is really, first of all, it's probably poorly named because ASP.NET 5 is a brand new web stack. It really should be called something 1.0 because it is a brand new web framework built from scratch and with a whole bunch of new plumbing underneath it. Of course, Microsoft, pretty much uses that ASP.NET brand everywhere when we're talking about web development. So they pretty much have kept it, but unfortunately, it is a bit confusing because all of the old stuff, if you will, up to this point, really isn't moved forward at all. And it's certainly not existing applications and libraries and things like that. So this whole ASP.NET 5 architecture is brand new. It is certainly inspired by some stuff that we had before, and there are a lot of similarities in terms of how things look, but in terms of actually, the code for it, brand new framework. One of the things that kind of fell out of this brand new framework is this concept of the core CLR, and this kind of is going to help solve some of these problems. More around this item at the bottom here, which had to do with cross-platform and portability. And so what the core CLR is a new version of the .NET runtime. And the intent with this version of the .NET runtime is it is a smaller, lighter weight version of the CLR. The intent with the CLR, though, is that it is small and lightweight. It's pretty much designed for building web server applications. And it is meant to be portable in the sense that the way that you use this version of the CLR is you basically do bin deploy. So you take this core CLR and you put it into the bin directory of your web application, and then that's the version of .NET that your application is built on top of. Okay, so this is basically an attempt to solve that problem where you have two different versions of your apps, maybe running on two different versions of .NET, and you'd like to put them onto the same server. Okay, if you are loading .NET from your bin directory, then you don't care what's installed on the machine at all. Okay, so that's kind of the concept of this core CLR. This core CLR is not replacing the current desktop CLR or full CLR. There's kind of a bunch of different names that you'll hear for this thing. But so it's a new CLR. In a sense, you can maybe think of it, and not that it's deployed in the same context, but in a sense, it's kind of like what we had with like Silverlight. Silverlight was a different version of the .NET runtime, and you would use that in that environment when you were building that type of application, okay? So you could still build a desktop app, and it would use the desktop CLR, and then you could do a Silverlight app, and it would use a Silverlight CLR. Same thing here with core CLR. They sometimes call this the cloud optimized CLR. Of course, cloud is a big buzzword for Microsoft, so they have to throw that in there in the way they present things. But basically, if you want to bring the CLR with your application, then you can, and you can use this core CLR. You can also still use the existing CLR, right? The desktop CLR. So maybe your application, needs a bunch of things that are from the desktop CLR. You can still use that one, but you're still relying upon the machine-wide install of .NET rather than a version of .NET that you're bringing with your app out of the bin directory. Okay, and again, you still suffer from those versioning issues that I had mentioned before. So that's what this core CLR is. Again, people probably have heard of this, and that's kind of where this fits in. A few other things about the core CLR is Microsoft is developing it as open source. So that's actually kind of an interesting thing with their whole new movement towards open source. So they are developing this in the open. Again, as part of that development, though, because it is a smaller version of .NET, it doesn't have everything that the full framework might have. WCF, WPF, things like that maybe won't make sense for more modern web applications. Another thing about the core CLR is that it is designed to be cross-platform. So Microsoft is basically making this thing work across Windows, Linux, and Macintosh. And because it is open source, somebody went out there and they actually contributed to the core CLR already to actually even port it to FreeBSD. So the FreeBSD, I believe, was an outside contribution from the community. So that's a really interesting, factoid about the core CLR is that, it's getting this cross-platform support from both Microsoft and from the community. So anyway, that's another thing kind of fitting into this new picture with ASP.NET 5 is this thing called the core CLR. So what this means then is that we have, again, like I said, we have the regular full desktop CLR. That's still going to be there when all this new stuff comes out. The next version of .NET, by the way, that is coming out, the desktop version, is going to be .NET 4.6. And this core CLR will be, its brand new version, whatever number they end up putting on that. And so you have basically multiple CLRs that your application can use. And in fact, the core CLR, there may be multiple. I mean, the intent with the core CLR is with it being smaller and it being able to be deployed with your app. Microsoft intends to update this thing much more frequently than they do the desktop CLR. So maybe every quarter, maybe every month. And the other thing about it, which I forgot to mention as well, is it's actually going to be deployed as a NuGet package. So the entire CLR itself is going to be able to pull down into your app as a NuGet. Okay, so getting back to this, we have multiple CLRs, whether it's the desktop CLR or the core CLR or whichever version of the core CLR. And this is where this concept of DNX comes in. So now that we have multiple versions of the .NET runtime, we have to have some mechanism for managing these different versions. It's kind of like different versions of a library. You can just pick a different version of the library and go with it. But the CLR is really kind of the your hosting environment for your code. And so you may build an app that only wants to run in the core CLR, or maybe you need more features and you have to run in the full desktop CLR, or maybe you're building a library that wants to target both environments. And so what Microsoft had to come up with next is this tooling or some mechanism to deal with multiple CLRs. And so that's what this thing called DNX is. So DNX is the .NET execution environment, and it's a few things. It's some tooling and SDK tools that us as developers are going to use. As we're building an application, we're going to use this DNX tooling to pick which version of .NET that we want to work with. We're going to use it then to also load our NuGet packages on top of our application and basically kind of package up and build our application. So DNX is this tool to help manage all these different .NETs. The next thing DNX is going to give us then is some mechanism for then at runtime, your application needs to load up some version of .NET. And so that's the other thing that DNX is. It's actually a runtime host. So this runtime host is what's going to actually then, based on how you invoke it, is going to pick up a version of .NET and have that initialized. This is something that we've sort of taken for granted in the Windows world for many years, is that when you build a .NET application, the compiler puts little flags in the binary that tells the operating system that when you launch this binary that we need to bootstrap the .NET runtime. and it's just, whichever .NET runtime you have compiled against, or maybe it's even in your config file. So we need something similar for these newer CLRs, and this is needed also because part of this whole movement in ASP.NET 5 is to be cross-platform. So we could actually be running this stuff from a Macintosh or from Linux, for example. So that's what we need, is we need an abstraction to then load the CLR. And then the last thing is when your application gets loaded, the last thing that DNX is going to give us is this sort of runtime application host. And what that means is that we can now start to have, if we go through this loading process for loading your application, then we can start to add in some of these other features. So if I go back a couple slides here, some of these other features that I talked about in terms of like an updated build system, right? We talked about Node.js and how you don't have to actually go through a compilation phase to run your Node.js code. You just run and point at a text file, and the system just loads it and runs it. So that's actually the next thing that DNX is going to do for us, is they are going to actually dynamically compile your code on the fly. So there is no more formal build step that you have to go through with these DNX style applications. What will happen is when you launch DNX, the application host will load up. It knows the directory that your source files reside in, and it will kick in with Roslyn, which is the new C# compiler, and it will do all the dynamic compilation of all of your source files. And so this is a really interesting change in how we are going to be building our applications with .NET, is that they're just loose text files, and this DNX stuff can just go and run it directly. As part of that then, as part of the whole bootstrapping process, this is where they're going to layer in the newer dependency injection system. So dependency injection is starting from the loader and the compiler for your application. And so this is how they bootstrap the entire stack all the way up to your application with dependency injection. So what I'm going to do is I am going to basically demo a bunch of this DNX stuff for you. Like I said, about half of the session is going to be on DNX, just looking at kind of how to get started with this stuff. Okay, and then what we'll look is how ASP.NET sits on top of this. Now, to get DNX, actually, by the way, here's a quick comparison because there is so much borrowed from Node.js. This is not a perfect comparison of Node.js, but it kind of gives us some loose correlations to the features in Node.js. So, of course, we're using C# here in this environment, and in the Node.js, you're running JavaScript. This DNX system, you're going to be using like the core CLR as your version of .NET to load in. It could also be the desktop CLR, though. You could also put that there. And then in the Node world, they use the V8 engine from Chrome. The tooling in the Node world, they use NPM, and in the DNX world, of course, we're going to be using NuGet. There's some new command line tools. So there is a new command line tool called DNX. There's also one called DNU that we'll see, and that's kind of our package manager. When you run your Node app, you run it with Node, and in the DNX world, you run it with DNX. And then there are frameworks on top. So we have ASP.NET 5, that's our web hosting framework, and then MVC on top of that is going to be our web application framework. So the DNX system is still very young, so we don't have tons of packages that maybe compete with, say, MVC. There is Nancy, so that is definitely still very popular and continuing their support into this world. But things like SignalR and Entity Framework, those are all coming from Microsoft. In the Node world, they don't quite rely upon any one vendor. And in fact, they very much kind of like the diversification. So that's the one kind of main difference about the Node community, is they have a much better is perhaps the wrong word, a much more vibrant, shall we say, and competitive framework, open source frameworks out there that are kind of competing with each other. That there's something to be said about that there's definitely, it's good to have a lot of these different frameworks out there trying to compete and provide a lot of good functionality like that. Okay, so I imagine we will see the same in our our DNX world going forward over the next few years. Okay, so how do you get this DNX stuff? Well, one thing is we probably want to go and go to Microsoft and find out where to get this stuff. So I mentioned that all this stuff is being developed as open source. So not only is the core CLR, but also ASP.NET 5 itself and MVC as well. And they're all doing this up on GitHub. So if you go to GitHub, ASP.NET/home This is kind of the starting page for all this new ASP.NET stuff. Under here is some, this is where I started reading about, just kind of how to get started. They even tell you how to get started by installing the tooling here. Okay, so this DNX tooling, as we're going to see, they have some tools, like I said, DNX, DNU, and this other one called DNVM. And so I'm going to talk about these. But basically, you need to bootstrap the install. So if you're not using Visual Studio, then you basically need to run these command line tools, whether you're on Windows or on the Mac. And you can go and set these up and install these on your machine. Okay. Of course, if you have Visual Studio and you install that, then it will bring these tools with it as well. That's one of the things, another things about sort of this modern development that Microsoft was trying to do is they were trying to modernize the development and modernize this, that sort of sounds funny, but kind of going back to a command line experience. Because we are running or trying to target cross-platform, they wanted to give the ability to run the commands and the tools and use these SDKs and do whatever you need to do without a heavyweight tool like Visual Studio. So all of the experience, if you will, is very much command first, and then Visual Studio, if that's the tool you want to use, will be on top of that. But they're trying to make it very, very or make it possible to not use Visual Studio for all these things. And I think they are pulling that off. So anyway, that's why this is a command line first sort of install. So there are the two commands you would run. I actually have a VM here running, so let me switch to that. And I have a command prompt here. And so what happens is when you install this DNX tooling, actually let me run Windows Explorer here. You end up getting some tools installed into your path. And the first one is this thing called DNVM. And DNVM is what's called the .NET Version Manager. So when you install this DNX tooling, the install creates this directory under your user profile. And it puts this bin directory here into your path. So if I look on my file system under users, broc, and .dnx, then you end up with this bin directory in your path. And so this DNVM is this thing called the .NET Version Manager. That's what I said is the first thing we're going to have to do here is manage which version of .NET you want to work with. So DNVM gives you the ability to install new versions of .NET. And again, we're primarily talking about .NET, the core CLR here. But it also helps you manage the desktop, whichever desktop ones you have installed as well. And so that's kind of the first thing that you're going to do here. So what it has is command line tools, so DNVM list. And what this does is it will list the versions of .NET that I currently have installed on this machine. And so what I have here, this VM I'm running is from when they released the Visual Studio 2015 release candidate, probably a couple months ago, and they had beta 4 of ASP.NET 5 and MVC6. So that's the version that I'm looking at here. And so DNVM lists the versions of .NET that I have on this machine. If you look, they are just mapped to, again, my local user's file system. That's another thing about this new system is that, being all command line driven, it's also just per user profile driven. So you don't need to be an admin to go install any of the stuff, and that kind of is in line with the whole concept of bin deploying whatever version of .NET. So if I go look in this runtimes folder, you'll see I just have folders with, these different versions of .NET. And so what I have is the basically the concept of the desktop CLR, that's just CLR. And then this core CLR here is the lightweight version of .NET that I had talked about. Okay? And if you go into these folders, you'll see, like the core CLR, there is actually a NuGet package here, and that is how it was deployed. And if you see the NuGet package here is around 14 megabytes, which kind of tells you about the size of the version of .NET, right? The core CLR itself is about 15 megs when you bring it with you to your own application. If we go to the other one, to the full desktop CLR, you'll actually see this one's actually much smaller, oddly enough. But actually that makes sense because the full CLR actually has already been installed on your computer. So what this 3 megabytes is here is really just a bunch of shims that forward everything to the regular desktop CLR. The point, though, is that I have these sort of, with DNVM, I have this facade over versions of .NET, whether it's the full .NET or this core CLR. And what I can do then is I can use this use command, and this use command allows me to say which version that I want to use at any one time. What this is doing, and you can actually tell right now, I have this version with the star here, is my current active version. All this means is to set an active version. Oops, 1.0.0-beta4, for example. What that does is dnvm. What that does is, and this even tells you what it does, is it basically sets that version of .NET. It has a bin directory, and it just sets this up in my path. So by basically using a version of .NET, all of the tools that are in this particular version of .NET's bin directory are now in my path, and that's all it means to switch back and forth and use one version of .NET or another. So basically, I am switching back and forth between a version of .NET by picking a different bin directory that's in my path. Once I have done that, then I have a couple more tools that I can use. One is called DNX and one is called DNU. And DNX is the application loader that I had talked about before, and DNU is the utility basically for me to do NuGet downloads and things like that, package up my app, and I can even deploy it with the DNU utility. So DNVM allows me to switch back and forth between versions of .NET. DNX is what actually loads my app, and DNU allows me to configure and manage my app. So let's build an app. Oops, wrong folder here. Let's go to demos. Okay, oops, cd demos. So what I have here right now is an empty folder. I'll make a directory called app, and then app here, I'll go in and create my first thing here. Okay, so I'm going to create my first, sort of hello world app here. I'm going to be using DNX to basically run a command line app. So DNX can be used just to load .NET code. And of course, command line apps fall under that category. Now, I could use Notepad if I wanted to go do this, but Microsoft, in an attempt to show that DNX and this new ASP.NET 5 can be built with lighter weight tooling. You want something perhaps a little bit more heavyweight than Notepad, but not as heavyweight as Visual Studio. So Microsoft recently released this new editor called Code, or Visual Studio Code. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to launch Code on this current directory, and then we'll do my editing with Code. And what's nice about it is, it's still sort of in development, as it were. So it's not quite perfect yet, but it is something I can show off here and show just getting started building a simple application and running it from the command line. So what I'll do here is I'll go in here and I'll create my starter app.cs, okay? And I'll do my traditional, using system, public class program. I'll do public static. Actually, I don't even need static. It's just void main. And I can do console.writeLine, hello DNX like this. Okay? So that's just real quick to get started. Now, if I want to run this application, I can run it from the command line, and I use this DNX thing. DNX takes two arguments. It takes a path to the folder that is your program. So I'm in the folder already, so I'll just pass dot. And then you pass this command. Commands are ways of telling, the DNX system what app to load. And if the app is what's in the folder, then I can just give it a well-known command called run. So run is kind of a hard-coded thing. Really, I'm basically pointing it at an assembly, and that assembly has to have a program with main. So I could do a dnx.run. Okay. Now, actually, this is not going to quite run yet because the other thing I'm missing here is, this is a little too loosey-goosey, but I do need to give a little bit of information to the loader about maybe libraries that I need and things like that. So there is a project.json file, okay, that I can run here. And what a project.json file is basically a configuration file. And this is now, there we go. That took a while, but a project.json file is basically a JSON file, and you can kind of think of it as like the replacement for Visual Studio projects to kind of tell the environment about dependencies that you have and things like that. So that's kind of the kind of things you put in here is you put in dependencies. If you need to download a library from NuGet, you'll put that in here. or if you need to configure something about your application, that's the job of project.json. So you need at least an empty project.json to run, your sort of standard hello world project. So that's exactly what happened here. I basically got my hello world, and it did my good old hello DNX. Now it did that on the full CLR. So it's currently, I'm using the full CLR. So let me just show you real quick running on the core CLR, and then we'll start to do some ASP.NET. To run on the core CLR, I'm going to do dnvm use 1.0.0 beta 4 / runtime core CLR. Okay? And so then what's going to happen here is I now switch my path to use now the core CLR. Now when I run DNX, it's going to be the one out of the different directory, and that's going to bootstrap, the other CLR, basically. And you can even see dnvm list. We should now be pointing at now the new CLR. We are. Okay? Now when I run this, dot and then run, what's happening here is we're going to actually get an error. And we're going to get an error for a couple of different reasons. One is this thing called console, which comes out of the system namespace, does not exist in the core CLR. The core CLR is really bare bones. It has like the jitter, and some, like the low level stuff that .NET needs to run. And so the libraries that you're used to using aren't actually in it. So like system.console does not exist in the core CLR. So this is where the project.json file is helpful. I can come in here and say, I want to load, a library. And so now all of the things that used to be in .NET are actually being factored out into small little NuGets that are available for download. So what I can do is I can go grab system.console and pull in and say the version of the console class that I want. Now, the versions here are a little tricky right now because we're still pretty early in like these betas of development. And so I want to get the right one. So actually, I already have a folder open here. What I'm going to show you here is in my file system, in the DNX folder where I showed you where the runtimes were and your DNVM tool. This is also where your packages are going to be deployed to. So when you do sort of the equivalent of a NuGet, where you grab and fetch it, it used to go in the project folder. Now they're a little bit smarter about it, and they're sharing them sort of a per user profile, if you will. So this is like a cache for all the NuGets that any of your apps might have needed. So if we go in here, you'll see I actually have a ton of NuGets already loaded, and system.console should be one of them right here. And so I have a bunch of versions in here. I'm just going to grab the first one on the list here. And it's the one that's already here, and I know that particular version works. Again, that's one of the gotchas right now with working with this stuff right now is that version mismatches are actually quite problematic or quite frequent and problematic just because they're changing things so rapidly. I expect as things get more mature, these version issues will start to go away. Now, I'm going to run this again, and it's going to give me one more error. And it's basically saying, hey, you know what? We didn't quite guarantee that you've downloaded this NuGet. And so there is this DNU tool that I mentioned that we need to run called DNU restore. And what that does is it basically goes, and if this library weren't installed on the machine, it will go download it, and then it would download it into the cache, and then this other file gets created called project.lock.json, which is kind of a strange name, but it just is, it's, to be honest, I said that there wasn't really a compilation step, but this is sort of like the compilation step. It basically is making sure that all of our dependencies are in order, we have them all, and we know exactly what versions of all these things that we have. So it's kind of like a build step, except your actual .cs files are still sitting there as loose files. Okay. Now, of course, when you're in Visual Studio, this will happen for you. Even you noticed here with Visual Studio Code, it even said, hey, we may have to do this thing. So I hit save in here and it popped up, and it's basically this sort of its version of, hey, you need to go do a build. Okay. Okay. So anyway, now that I've done that, a DNU restore, which should be fine. I can then do dnx.run again. I'm actually going to get one more error. And the one more error is that I don't have even things like, I don't know if you remember the error that I had at the very beginning. DNU restore dnx.run. The error I got was like really, really simple stuff like console doesn't exist, but also system.object is not defined. I mean, this is like really core stuff from .NET. So there are actually two things I need to pull in, system.console and also Microsoft.C#. That's another library, basically, because I'm using things from C#. And that's the other bare bones library that I need to include. So this is just really interesting that now with this, core CLR, we are basically, all the things that we made assumptions about, in doing .NET all these years, might not all be there anymore on this core CLR. And this tends to be one of the more frustrating things about learning this new environment is you just don't realize anymore, what's there and what's not. And DNU restore, did I not grab the right things? Oh. dnx.run. Oh, awesome. This is great. Of course, I totally broke something in my development here. So program main, this is all happy. Project.json. I'm not sure what I got wrong actually here. So one thing I was going to show you though is hopefully this was supposed to work, but then the thing is though, the system.console and the C#, that's all there in the desktop CLR. The only reason we need to pull these in is for the core CLR. So a lot of times we may have project-specific dependencies, and so frameworks. And that's why this other element exists, is so that you can set up CLR 451. Okay. And so the CLR 451 is the one we have now, and then there's also called Core CLR 50. And these are just well-known strings that we have to know about to configure our application. Core CLR is the one that is the core CLR. And again, that's why I said a little bit earlier, I'm not sure what version they're going to put on this thing. They're putting it as 5.0 here, which is sort of odd. But the whole thing about this is that we can take this dependencies and we can actually make this specific to that version of CLR. So in other words, these dependencies, I don't need them globally per se. I really just need them for this one version of .NET. So I'm not sure if that was my issue. So let's do a DNU restore, because I've kind of played around with the config file, and dnx.run, and I have a feeling it's still going to break. Yep, something. I probably did something silly here. So no value metadata version. Yep, okay. Microsoft.C#. I may have a version between a mismatch between these, although I thought this version of C# worked with that version of the core CLR. So dnvm list. Yeah, no, I think I'm good on this. So yeah, I have some bonehead mismatch of versions is what I suspect. And this is also another thing why this tool's great. I mean, hey, awesome that you can do, very simple text editor. But of course, this doesn't quite have all the great IntelliSense that Visual Studio has. So that's the other thing to go check out. So maybe what I can do is run Visual Studio, kind of build the same thing and see what I got wrong on my command line. So I'm going to launch Visual Studio 2015 here. I'm going to create a new project. And what I can do is go create a new, so here under templates under C#, they have web, and so they now have a console application under web, which again sounds really strange, but that's basically all this means, is that you're just building a DNX app that's geared for running on the console. And so let's go pop that in there. I wonder what versions we'll see when we get here. Like I said, I thought I was grabbing the same ones that this version of Visual Studio and this beta version of DNX had, but of course that's what we get for running with beta software. And so what I'll do is once this comes up, hopefully I can get this working, and then we can switch over and start adding in ASP.NET. And this is very slow, apparently. I'll go ahead and close. Well, I'll leave this up because I want to compare the two. There we go. So here is our, basically pretty much the same thing that I had before. I have using system, I have a program. We don't need, we don't need this to be static. Console dot write line hello, like this. Okay, and then the project.json, I think they're going to have more because they have link and things like that. But you can see that Visual Studio is aware of these dependencies. And then these frameworks that I showed you. I had Microsoft C#, 22816. Of course, this is very much the developer in me wanting to figure this out. So 22816, and then system.console. Sorry about that. So I had 22231, and this had 22816. Oh, well, that would make sense. The 2816s go together. So anyway, that might have been the reason that this was off. So if I run this here, though, at a Visual Studio, this should work. Of course, it says hello, right? This other command line window, though, I'm running, so when you run out of Visual Studio, this actually is a good thing to take a look at, is that if you look at the properties of your project, you will see the same sort of, concepts around, hey, we can pick a specific version of DNX. So if I pick in the .NET Core DNX instead, and I run this, chances are this is going to work as well. Yeah, exactly. So I just think I had a version mismatch of libraries that I was using. So if I had done the same thing here, and gone into, oh, where did this project go? Is it my demos folder? I thought, oh yeah, console one, app here, source, console app one. Pretty much bare bones, just like the other one, right? My program, my project.json. So here I can do dnvm list, which again, I'm using that one. So dnvm use 1.0.0 beta 4 core CLR. And I should be able to do dnx run here, and hopefully just to prove that now is running out of the command line, just like I ran out of Visual Studio a few minutes ago. Except through Visual Studio, you picked some checkboxes in a UI. Here, we're doing it via the path arguments. But Visual Studio is really just sitting on top of the same command line stuff. Okay, good enough. I think that's good enough to move on to ASP.NET now. I think you guys have the idea for this. So we talked about the command line tools. I talked about the dnvm tool to find a look at the versions of .NET that you're working with and switch between them. DNX then will run your app basically. There are some configuration that needs to be done in the project.json file, mostly around dependencies and configuring dependencies for specific versions of .NET. The other thing we have here in this config file typically is this thing called commands. The command I was running before was just running main out of the project I was in, but you can put other commands. So you could just have a directory without a main as long as you point your command at some assembly that does have a main. So in other words, a command is really just something that with an entry point that will kick off the application. And we'll see this when we start to do web development here in a minute, that your web apps don't have main, your web server will, right? And so what we do for commands here is we point it at an application that knows how to host the web ASP.NET environment. So I talked about running DNX. I briefly mentioned DNU. DNU does more than just download our NuGets. It's also how you take an application and package it up. So if you're building a class library, this is how you actually package up your code into a NuGet so that it can be used by other applications. And then if you do have a web application, you can use this to do the web publishing step as well. Okay, so getting into ASP.NET 5. So ASP.NET 5 really kind of continues where OWIN and Katana left off. So if you haven't learned about OWIN and Katana in the last couple of years, then this will be Basically, sort of the same education process. If you do know about OWIN and Katana, then ASP.NET 5 will be really, really familiar. And really what OWIN and Katana were all about was moving away from that system.web architecture I had mentioned for all the reasons I talked about at the beginning, right? System.web being a very large bloated framework. They have a lot of code running on every request. There's a lot of overhead on every request. And Microsoft's been wanting to move away from this. So OWIN and Katana was like the first stab at trying to move away from this heavy, bloated sort of web architecture. And what it basically allowed you to do was you built your own web pipeline. And what I mean by that is that the web server gave you nothing, and you had to deliberately opt in to what code you wanted to run on every single request. And so you did this by registering what's called middleware. And so like in the ASP.NET architecture, you had the HTTP module architecture where every request coming in, you had the begin request and the authenticate request and the authorize request and the map handler request phase, and then the actual HTTP handler, and then all the other post-processing events. Here, in OWIN and Katana, you don't have any of that, and you define your own pipeline. So you load in these components called middleware, and the job of middleware is to receive a request and perhaps do some processing on it, and then call to the next middleware. So when you built an OWIN application, you ended up building a linked list of components, and they got to take a crack at every request coming into your web server. So when a request came in from a browser or a web API client or whatever, it would go to the first middleware, and the first middleware would call the next middleware, and they would just go call down the chain. And then once some part of the pipeline said, oh, I'm going to generate the response, then it would be done and you would exit through the exact same middleware. So middleware got to look at the request coming in and look at the request, going out of your web server. These are much like HTTP modules of system.web, but the way that you stitch all this stuff together is a little bit different. It's opt-in, okay? That architecture was started with OWIN and Katana. So OWIN was the specification for this, and Katana was Microsoft's implementation. So that was provided by Microsoft. Their first real big push into this was part of Visual Studio 2013. So, some 2 years ago. So that was, kind of the first hint that Microsoft was moving away from that older system web architecture to something new. This architecture looks very much like Node.js. This first attempt, though, they, made some mistakes with their implementation, and it was like a kind of an experiment, I suppose. It was like a V1, if you will. And so they learned a lot by implementing Katana, but then they thought, okay, we want to kind of redo it now. And so that's where ASP.NET 5 comes in. Conceptually, it's very, very similar. And in fact, Microsoft's even using that term to say that ASP.NET 5 and MVC 6, they're not binary compatible with the prior stuff, but they're conceptually compatible with the prior stuff, which is kind of a joke, but there is, hey, they're correct in saying that, is that logically it works very, very similar, but of course all the details are different. So anyway, that's kind of the idea, is that what we're going to do is you're going to write a hosting application. So this host is kind of up to you to decide what you're going to do. This host is basically the process that's hosting your web server code. Now, of course, that could be IIS, right? That's going to be a very common scenario where you want to run your new web code in IIS, but you could also run it out of your own console application or out of your own, out of anything you want, Windows service, whatever. And so they provide non-IIS hosts for this new web server pipeline. So they actually have a couple that are meant for non-IIS. So one is called Web Listener. Web Listeners for Windows, and it will basically load up on top of HTTP sys on a Windows operating system. So basically in whatever process you want. Kestrel, on the other hand, is intended for basically the Unix environments, and this loads in the same library that Nginx uses, which is Nginx is a very popular web server running usually on some sort of non-Windows operating system. I forget the name of the library. libuv, I think, is the name of it. I think that's right. Anyway, so it's basically a very popular, non-Microsoft web host. So basically, they have one that will actually run on Linux, and you can run this new ASP.NET 5 and DNX stuff in that server. And so basically, then you run these things, and you configure what middleware that you want to run. Okay, and so middleware then gets to look at a request and can generate a response. Now, the thing with middleware is that we find that people build entire application frameworks in middleware. So it actually turns out in OWIN and Katana, that's how Web API was packaged. Web API was actually middleware that could run in a Katana host. And so conceptually very similar here now in ASP.NET 5. MVC6 is just middleware that runs inside of this ASP.NET 5 pipeline. So you can write your own middleware, and it can sit right next to MVC6. Of course, we'll look at MVC6 next week. So that's the high-level picture here. So what I want to show you then is how we get this started. So like I said, we can run this stuff out of IIS if we want, or we can run this out of a command line. Okay, now I actually already have a console app here kind of started. So what I think I'll do is I'll start with the command line approach, and show you how that works. And what we're going to basically be doing is loading the hosting framework. Of course, in a console app, I'm not going to be using IIS, so I'm going to use this thing called Web Listener. And what Web Listener does then is it will launch your web application that you have configured and build up your pipeline. So that's what I'm going to show you now. So let's go over here. I actually have my console app, and let's see if I can pull this off here in a console app and not build a web project. So this is specifically not a web project in Visual Studio. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to pull in a dependency, and the dependency I'm going to pull in is that Microsoft ASP.NET server and Web Listener. So this is the Web Listener. And by the way, as you can tell, the IntelliSense is actually pretty good here in Visual Studio for pulling in NuGets. So what this does is this pulls in the NuGet for the web server. And you can tell over here the references. You have both versions of .NET that you're configured to use, so DNX 4.5.1 and .NET Core 5.0. And what I just pulled in the Web Listener package. This is part of the updated NuGet sort of approach here. You just grab the top level package and all the dependencies are then pulled in. So by pulling in Web Listener, we actually are also pulling in this new ASP.NET runtime. And so ASP.NET.HTTP is the library that has all those core things. So this is a much more cleaned up sort of approach to pulling in dependencies than we had in our prior version with NuGet, because we had packages.config, I believe, which was an XML file, and it flattened out all of your dependencies, whereas here it sort of knows how to unwind it hierarchically. So this makes this config file much cleaner. That's actually, by the way, by adding this text file, that was the equivalent of using the right-click and do manage NuGet packages. So actually, I didn't even think to show you that, but that's also the NuGet is still here. But when you do it in these new DNX projects, the dialog just adds a text entry to here. So either way works. So what this has done now is pulled in my actual web server code that knows how to host this stuff in a command line app. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to build a new command. I'm no longer going to run my application's main, right? I don't want to be the entry point anymore. I want the web server to do the startup. So that's what I'm going to put here. Is I'm going to put in Microsoft.ASP.NET.hosting, and what this does is one of the dependencies of this is a library that has main in this package. So in this library, there is a class with main, and main will start up just like my main that I had before, and it basically wants me to pass it what web server it wants to load up. So basically, I put the name of this web server in here, and I tell it what URL that I want to listen on. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. So that's basically what I'm going to do here is I've now loaded in really the minimal stuff I needed to get ASP.NET running. I have a web server that I can run from a command line. That, of course, has a dependency on all the ASP.NET plumbing. And now when I launch my command line tool, I want to run that program, and I'm passing some parameters to configure that. Basically running the command line or the self-hosted web server. So you know what? I think... I guess I don't have my command prompt up anymore, but I'll go ahead and run this. One of the things about this new project system here is that these commands are, what app to run basically. And so the menuing system up here actually knows about them. So by me adding web, I ended up getting an entry in here called web. And when I run this, I think this should run my web server. Okay. So, of course, that gives me a wonderful error here. So Microsoft.ASP.NET.Hosting. Let me add this as a dependency just in case. I don't think that's the issue though. Okay, so this is restoring. It's doing that DNU restore that I talked about. I think this eventually worked. Yeah, it did. Looks like it did. I'm going to load that as my app. All right, one more time. And, oh, actually that was that might have been the error I had before. So I actually wasn't quite finished configuring this thing. That might have been the error and I wasn't paying attention. So actually that's the one more thing I'm missing here is that, like I said, when you load up this new ASP.NET pipeline, you have to configure it with what middleware you want. And so actually I think that was the error that it was giving me. Again, I didn't quite pay close enough attention to it. So what you're usually expected to do is, again, instead of you having main, what you're going to do is you're going to configure a class called startup. Public class startup. Okay. And this is going to have a method that configures your pipeline. So if you have done OWIN and Katana, this will look pretty familiar. So we do this application builder thing. Okay, and the Visual Studio IntelliSense is quite nice at pulling in the right namespaces. And really right now, that's all I need. So I think that's the error I was getting, is it was looking for this configure class, this class with this configure method, and it wasn't finding it. So if I run this now, I think I should get yeah, okay, good. So now I actually have my web server up and running. Okay. Now this configure is where you configure your middleware. So again, what is middleware? It's basically the code that you want to run in your web server. And middleware gets to look at a request coming in and can optionally generate the response. Now I have no middleware running here right now, but I did have my web server up and running properly from the DNX commands from my project.json. So that's really the only thing I need to do next is actually configure the middleware that I want to run. And so what you do is you do this off of this application builder. There are methods called use, that's one of them. And what this does is it allows you to register the code that's going to run when a request comes in. And middleware really is just a function. It is a function that gets called, and you get passed information about the request via an object called HTTP context. HTTP context in this world is actually a different HTTP context than the ASP.NET HTTP context that we had in system.web. They call it the same thing, and it's kind of logically the same thing. It's just totally different implementation. So we basically have this mechanism of registering this low-level function that gets invoked when a request comes in, and they hand you the HTTP context. The other thing they hand you is the next reference, and the next reference is basically a delegate to the next middleware. What you're going to end up doing is typically you end up registering, multiple middlewares, and by registering multiple functions or multiple blocks of code, then you are, in essence, building your own pipeline for your web server. So you get to say what happens first and what happens next. The order is very important here because the order that you register these functions is the order that they get to look at the request. So when the request comes in, so let's do console.writeLine. Okay, we get the HTTP context, and we have the request object. It also has the response object, so it's kind of like the old HTTP request. And we have like the path coming in, for example. All right. Now, the next thing we get to do at this point is your middleware might look at the request coming in, which is what this is doing, and then it needs to decide what to do. Is it going to generate the response, or do I not generate the response and I want some other middleware to handle it? That's what the next reference is for. If you want the next middleware to be invoked, you will invoke the next delegate, in essence. Okay? Now, again, the reason I'm getting red squigglies here is because the function that gets invoked here needs to be asynchronous. So you have to return a task. So what we can do is use the good old async and await keywords here and make that that whole function, that whole middleware, asynchronous. Okay? So again, if you've seen OWIN or Katana, very, very similar, right? The idea is middleware is code that gets to process the request. You put them in sequence, and they get to do this, well, asynchronously, but they get called in order. So this first middleware I'm configuring, all it's going to do is look at the request and print it out to the console, and then call the next middleware. The next middleware is going to sit here, and actually, you know what? I don't need a next. I'm actually going to get rid of this. There's another function instead of use. It's called run. And run is a way to basically build a piece of middleware that does not invoke any other middleware. So here then, I will basically do async context.response dot write async. And I don't think, actually, that's an extension method. And I need to pull in the right namespace to get my extension method, which is HTTP here. Okay, so then I will do write async, and I'll print out, h1 hello ASP.NET 5, for example. Okay. Oh, and that's async, so I can do async and await here. All right, so what I've done here is ASP.NET 5 basically allows me to build this pipeline of middleware. Okay, I run this in my web server, which is the command line web server. And now I should be able to open up a browser here somewhere and go to localhost port 12345 and type, test or something like that. And so this will then go and call that server, and exactly. So we ended up getting called twice. All right, once for the test URL. And it looks like once we did that with Chrome, Chrome decided to go ask for a favorite icon as well, which I think, to be honest, our favorite icon replied with the H1 tag as well, which wasn't really what a favorite icon should be. But you get the idea. So we now have this bare bones web server up and running that basically only ever prints out H1 tags. But that's what ASP.NET 5 is, right? No matter what URL you put in here, right, over and over and over, that's basically getting routed through this web server that I've configured here. Now, a few things about this. This web server is using the ASP.NET 5 architecture. Because ASP.NET 5 is designed to run in different hosts, it's abstracting us from our host. So I don't necessarily know or care that I'm running an IIS or out of a command line or on Linux or on a Mac or on a Windows server, right? Or in whoever's cloud. So that's kind of a nice architecture. This is, like I said, very much inspired by the good first steps that they made with OWIN and Katana. And that was one of the good things that we had out of that, was this abstraction from the web server. So we're really decoupled from our web server. But now the code running on our web application is exactly what we've configured it to do. So I said in the old ASP.NET architecture, right, we would have session state running and things like that. You only have what you put in here. So what we will see, again, next week is that MVC is actually configured here as like an extension method. They have an extension method called useMVC, and MVC gets registered into your pipeline. If you want session state, right, they have a use session state, extension method like this, okay? So actually, let me show you how to use these real quick. So middleware is only the code you get or only the code you want that you've explicitly configured. I've configured this using the use keyword, where I can just do an inline delegate. Run is basically configuring middleware that just terminates the pipeline. You can also create middleware as a class. So my middleware, for lack of a better name, and you need to have two things. One is a constructor, and one is a method called invoke. invoke like this. So middleware is a class. The invoke call is basically the function. So the same function that I had up here with my use, that's the invoke function if you package up middleware as a class. And you get past the HTTP context. So I can do, console.writeLine, same thing I had before, right? Context.request.path, for example. But I then might want to invoke the next middleware. So that's what the constructor is for. The constructor needs to take what's called a request delegate as a parameter. And again, this looks pretty much like what we had in OWIN and Katana, if you've seen that before. By the way, if you've never seen OWIN and Katana, then you can kind of treat this like your education on OWIN and Katana, because, like I said, it's very, very similar. Okay, so we do await next like this. So basically, I've now created middleware as a class. Okay, and what am I getting error there? No. Okay, sorry. So we have middleware now as a class. So instead of doing an inline middleware like this, then what I can do is this other app.useMiddleware, and I put my middleware here as the class that I want to use. And so what will happen is then this extension method will go and instantiate my middleware, wire it up with the next middleware, and then when every request comes in, you'll get your invoke call. Okay. So again, you're still wired in the pipeline in the order that you configure it as. If I do a build here, let me close this one, do a build, and rerun it. All right, and this should still basically do the same. Right, printed data out. Okay, good. So this still basically works the same way. So you can imagine then entire application frameworks being encapsulated inside of some middleware class. And like I said, that's how MVC is delivered, and lots of other utility middleware. Middleware can see a request and call the next middleware or not, depending on whether or not it thinks it needs to handle the request. So this is basically what ASP.NET 5 is. It's actually fairly low level. People, when they start to look at ASP.NET 5, they might be a little surprised that where's the page, where are the web pages and where's the HTML and all that. And it turns out this is not what ASP.NET 5 is. ASP.NET 5 is this web pipeline of configuration where you string together the chunks of code that you want to run in your web server. Okay, but we are abstracted from the web server, and in fact, we're also abstracted from the .NET runtime by this whole DNX technology. So anyway, that's basically what we have here. I talked about some of the APIs here in the pipeline, right? We have this concept of use that allows you to register some middleware. We have run that allows you to terminate the pipeline. So in other words, that you're going to generate the response, so there's no need for a next. And the last one is this thing called map. Map allows you to fork the pipeline based on the incoming URL that the URL starts with. So maybe if the URL starts with /path, that you want certain things to run, and it allows you to create a fork, if you will. And it kind of allows you to dissect up the different type of code that will run based on the incoming URL. So this is actually quite a nice feature to use as well. So I talked about the run, right? Here's what run looks like. Here's then what the map looks like. So when you use map and you're going to fork the pipeline, you actually get now a new application builder. So you get a new application builder, and then on that you can register more middleware. But this will only run now beneath the path /hello. And then here's use. Use is basically doing some pre-processing. We invoke the next middleware. And again, the thing about this is that you're doing post-processing at this point as well. So with async and await, this makes this quite nice. Even though this is asynchronous, you're basically building pre-processing before the rest of the pipeline and then post-processing. This is sometimes described as the Russian doll sort of architecture, where middleware at the beginning wraps all the other middleware that comes after it, and then it can do pre-processing and post-processing with this sort of inside-out architecture. And then I showed you building middleware as a class, a very common thing. And again, that was really just to illustrate that whole application frameworks then are going to be built up using these entire middleware classes. Which, this is actually, I think, going to bring us to the end, because next week we're going to actually talk about that middleware, which is called MVC6. Right? But this lays the foundation. This really talks about the motivation for this whole new web architecture from Microsoft. They want to support different versions of .NET, having .NET side by side, having .NET be cross-platform for building your web applications. To do so, they had to introduce this DNX tooling and this DNX sort of hosting environment to help manage which versions of .NET you're using. And then on top of DNX, we can load in this new ASP.NET 5 pipeline for building a web server that has only the code that you want to run. Okay, and I didn't talk too much about the dependency injection system. We'll talk more about that the next session. I mean, there are so many other things layered on top of this. There's a new configuration system, and then we have, of course, all of our MVC and Web API style coding that we would want in some sort of application framework. But anyway, hopefully this was a useful introduction. Again, we will have near the end of this year, we're going to end up having a full 5-day class on all of these topics. So feel free to come check us out at develop.com. And I don't know if you guys can ask questions in the chat window here, but what I'll do is I'll try to see if there are any questions, and if you have questions, I'll see if I can answer them. Which I'm having a hard time reading this. Oh, here we go. So there was I saw a question about session state on my blog. If you search for think twice about using session state, I have a whole blog post on it. So it's more than I can just cover in a couple of minutes. But basically, having a stateful web server is problematic. Of course, sometimes you need that, but there are problems by keeping it in the server. So there are ways to address that. But personally, for me, I try to avoid it. So I can't really tell if there are any other technical questions. So anyway, yeah, I think we'll just leave it there. Of course, if you have questions, there's Twitter. You can ping me on Twitter or find my email. But anyway, hopefully, like I said, this was useful for you. And next week we will have the second half of this covering our coverage of MVC6. All right. Thanks for coming.